the Kitchen Studios. This is the Pencil Pushers Podcast.
Welcome, folks, to the Pencil Pushers Podcast. I'm your humble host, Mike Rosato. Today, we sit down with Jason Carne, designer and lettering artist who's worked with some of the biggest brands in the world: Disney, Warner Brothers, Harley-Davidson, Buffalo Trace, and MTV, to name a few. We talk about his life as a lettering artist, someone who's learned about this incredible craft from scratch, starting with hand-drawn music posters and logos for punk rock bands to painfully learning Illustrator in order to push himself into the modern world. We also dive into Camel Type Co., a site where he sells his own handcrafted fonts, and Lettering Library, a site where the archivist in him curates and sells PDF versions of vintage lettering books. Not to mention, this is a great spot to learn about his process, how to get into lettering, and what the future looks like for the art form, as well as what awesome projects he's in the middle of right now. If you've ever walked the streets of your favorite cities, admiring handmade signage, or looked at posters, spirits bottles, or beautifully lettered book covers, this is the place to be for the next hour. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our chat with Jason. We are here with lettering artist, graphic designer, archivist, music lover, etc., Jason Carne. Am I pronouncing your last name right?
Yeah, that's correct. Silent E.
Okay, awesome. Because my family's from Puerto Rico, so I always immediately say Carne, which is
me.
You know, I'm not sure. Yeah, exactly. So, but anyway, man, thank you for joining us on the Pencil Pushers Podcast, and welcome.
Yeah, glad to be here, man. Thanks for inviting me.
Just to get everybody up to speed, I met Jason a few years back at Creative South, probably around 2018 or so. And Creative South is a really amazing conference that they have in, is it Georgia? Is it like right on the cusp of Georgia, pretty much?
Yeah, it's Columbus, Georgia, which is like right on the border of Alabama. Like you could literally walk over the bridge right there and be in the next state. Right,
exactly. It's a great place for not only just graphic designers, graphic artists, but also just general creatives come together in a pretty small space for, design conferences. I mean, it gets bigger and bigger every year. And I had a chance I was wondering if you were really even going to remember me much, because we chatted just for a little bit, but we were all pretty much holed up in the same hotel for the weekend. But it's a great place to actually get together with people like us and just kind of commune and just kind of talk shop and learn about what everybody else is doing. The cool thing about that conference is everybody pretty much gets a chance to really sort of become family, and there's a lot of commonalities that I think people find with the struggles, the highs and the lows. I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of the biggest thing that drew me to that conference. The first year I went, I was kind of a skeptic because everybody has that, come as friends, leave as family is the motto that I hear all the time for it. But it actually is true in their case. I feel like most places try to push that vibe, but it doesn't really work. Even though it's gotten bigger and bigger every year, it still feels like it's the same sort of tight-knit community, and that we're just kind of bringing more people under our wing as it gets bigger. It's not like it's getting more exclusionary or anything. But yeah, it was great to just hang at the hotels, and there's a ton of great restaurants downtown, and you could just walk along the river. It's a cool spot where you could just kind of meet up and hang out with anybody. You just run into, your favorite designer at the coffee shop or something. It's kind of cool that way.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's pretty cool too how even you saying we as if not like you're a part of running the show, but that's really how it is. It really does feel like this sort of family vibe where we're all in it to make it the best we can, and it is that sort of inclusion type scenario over there. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I feel like it's not super ego driven like some of the bigger conferences I've been to where there's some really big names that feel untouchable. One funny thing I saw when I was there, this lady went up to John Contino one year, and she's like, "I can't believe you responded to my messages on Instagram and everything." And he's like, "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I?" He's like, "I'd like to talk to you." He's like, "Yeah." It's like, "I'm just a guy."
He's the nicest guy.
There is that weird element of celebrity to design in some sense. You're like, "Oh my God, that's the guy who did that thing," and you're like, "It's awesome." But everybody's just really nice and humble, and they're willing to talk shop and share, trade secrets and stuff like that. Nobody's really standoffish there. It's just a really welcoming vibe that I kind of dig.
So true. I think it's a true testament to Mike, the founder, the sort of brand value that he brings to that conference. I mean, I think it really is just basically his personality expressed in a design conference. I mean, if you really think about it,
Yeah, and he had all the right people around him too. Like Diane Gibbs is like the nicest lady on the planet, and she like always runs all the volunteer stuff. And it's like he has the right people in the right places. I think every year, and everybody works really hard behind the scenes. And I really miss it. I hate that we had to miss it twice in a row now. It kind of sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of, man, how's it been over the past year for you in terms of work? How's family? Everybody safe and everything? Or?
Yeah, luckily nobody in my family actually got a case of COVID. So that's extremely fortunate because I know that it's not been that great for everybody else. But as far as work goes, I managed to stay pretty busy, honestly, which really surprised me. Like right when it kicked off, I was like, okay, I got a bit saved away in the bank and I got to hope that it's going to last me however long this takes. And because of the niche that I'm in, which is like doing labeling and packaging for like spirits companies mostly right now, people didn't stop drinking during the pandemic. I think if anything, that
it
might
went
have
the opposite direction.
Yeah. So I had like the one sector of clients that was still making bank, and they were able to keep, hiring me like, oh, you could do another label or another thing for our distillery or brewery. And so thankfully I've been kept afloat by stuff like that.
Yeah. How did that, was that sort of a trajectory you were sort of looking into, getting into label designs for like liquor companies and stuff like that?
It was not specifically for spirits and liquor, but it ended up just kind of being that, just naturally. I did a label for a show in Kentucky. It was all about like outlaws and prohibition and things like that. So I thought like what I can contribute to the show would maybe be like this prohibition era liquor label, like this outlaw thing, like a moonshine and stuff. So I made this label, and I actually got it made by Valhalla Studios, and they did like gold foiling and embossing and die cutting. It was like really elaborate, and I wanted.
Was that your first project that had those types of applications?
Yep. Yeah, it was.
Materials
so it was
stuff?
kind of a bit of a learning curve for me on the production side of things too, because
I'm sure it was a beast.
Yeah, it wasn't as simple as just setting something up for like screen printing like I was used to. It was a lot more complex. But once I actually did that, and I kind of put it as like a proof of concept in my portfolio, like, hey, I can do this too. Because before then, I was doing a lot of like band shirts and just logos and branding and your typical design fare. But once I pushed myself into that realm, like kind of by accident almost, I started getting
How
a lot
long
of.
was that?
It was about 3 or 4 years ago now.
Okay.
So since then, it's been a lot of that kind of work. I think I've done well over 20 labels at this point. Which, I mean, probably doesn't sound like a lot over a stretch of a few years, but it's almost always like building a brand from the ground up. So it's not just a label, so it's coming up with like their logo and their strategy and the brand book and the web stuff and but yeah, I thought that it would just be a really good sector for me to start focusing on, because the level of detail and the backing of the funding that they have for this kind of stuff to really put all the bells and whistles into a print project. It's like every designer's dream to get to like, do all this foiling and then deboss and, really cool things that we never really get to do.
You don't have to worry about a client going, oh, it's not in the budget. Like, no, it's such an important part of the aesthetic of a lot of the, spirit company brands that are out there,
Yeah, it really is. Like, cigar boxes are like another big thing that's sort of like that. And you see that kind of transitioning into the 21st century now with like the marijuana packaging and all the CBD stuff. Right. So we're getting like a renaissance of that kind of thing coming in as well, that I hope I can work a little bit more in. I've done a few of those, but it hasn't been something that really took off as well as the liquor and spirits has.
Nice. Where did this all start, by the way? How did you start falling in love with letter art?
I think I've thought about this before, and I think it goes like way back to when I was in like middle school and just getting into like...
You grew up in New Jersey, is that right?
I did, yeah. And I was like a skater kid at that time, and I really loved like punk music and metal stuff. And one of the best parts of punk and metal was always the artwork, and they always had killer logos. And I was like, man, these are great. So I would like draw like the Morbid Angel logo on the back of my notebook, or like Slayer over and over. And like I didn't think about it at the time, but I was lettering. Like it never even crossed my mind that was a job. I was just like, oh, this is fun to do. And
yeah, it's like somebody who just sees like comic book art and you just want to try and emulate how to draw Spider-Man or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it was just for fun. And once I got out of high school, you know, a couple guys from my school were like, oh, you were that art kid in high school. Do you want to, you know, do a flyer for our show that's coming up, or you want to do our album art? Or so I started doing that kind of thing. And after a while, I was like, I actually like doing the letters better than I like doing the illustration or any of the graphics part of these things. And I think it might have even been like a link to architecture. I was really interested in that when I was younger, and seeing like the old like stone lettering.
Making a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Seeing the detail in your work, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably where it started. But how it transitioned into like a full-blown thing where I just draw letters, I don't really know. I think it just kind of I fell into it as time went on.
Yeah, was it something that that you even knew could be a career, or was that sort of later on in the game? I mean, did you have any idea of like what kind of job you actually wanted to have before? Did you think art could even be that?
No, actually, when I was in high school, I really wanted to be a draftsman, which basically I found out by the time I hit college that job doesn't even exist anymore. You have to be an architectural engineer and do like all the math that's involved with it too. So I couldn't just draw cool houses and make money for it. So after a semester of finding that out, I came home and started doing all like that band art for my friends. And actually, like the first jobs I was doing were like MySpace layouts. That was the big thing at the time.
Right.
It was me just like hacking together terrible code that I found online. just overlay that and just throw the ad 10,000 pixels off the screen so nobody sees it. And like,
right.
It was really bad coding. But eventually, like once that died off, I started doing more merch design, which kind of got me into like screen printing and working with limited colors. And then people just started asking me for like logos and things that were strictly letter based. So it was like sort of this slow transition, I think, over the last 15 years or so to get to this point.
Can you talk a little bit about what it is that, for those, just so you know, there's a lot of people that, you know, this is a podcast for the hand-drawn art. So there's a lot of different industries, a lot of different fields that people get into. Can you talk about the difference between what the difference between a font and a typeface is, just to keep something as fundamental as that?
Yeah. So the best way I've heard this explained is think of a typeface as an album and a font as a song. There's a lot of fonts in the song, but the typeface is the full album.
Right.
So, like, Futura Black is a font, but Futura is the typeface, basically. It's kind of like the more all-encompassing version of the font, I would say.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, and isn't a font technically the working expression too of a typeface in some way? That's how I had sort of formulated it in my mind. Like, it's how you can make it practically work. Like, you can draw anything and it can become a typeface as long as it's got letters in it, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it can't be used repeatedly at scale.
Yeah.
Am I wrong? Or okay.
I think that's correct, because I think font really wasn't even a term that came to be until the digital era. I think it was always like, you know, like wood type and metal type. I think those were just called typefaces. Yeah. And that wasn't necessarily something that you could do digitally, but you could typeset it for letterpress and, you know, all the offset printing and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So how does one go about creating their own typeface? Like, what is your process to actually creating that?
There's a lot of different pieces of software out there now. Like Font Self is one that a lot of people have been using lately. I haven't used it personally, but you can create a font directly inside of Illustrator, I believe. Like, it has some sort of intuitive software where it recognizes like, oh, this looks like an A, so it's your A for your font. So that's like the simplest way to like just jump in and get your feet wet, I think. But if you want to do something a little bit more robust, there's Glyphs, which I use. It's only like a $200 program. It's pretty cheap as far as software goes for this kind of stuff. Or you can step up to like RoboFont or FontForge, which are more like $1,000, I think. So that's like a little bit more prohibitively expensive to get into. But I think Glyphs starts off with like a 30-day free trial. So if you just want to try it, it's a good one to dive into.
Nice.
But typically,
that's just GLYT
GLYPHS.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. But typically, I design all of my letters in Illustrator first, and then I will port them over into Glyphs. And that's where I do all the fun stuff, like, you know, setting the metrics for your left and right side bearing and your kerning and your groupings and your ligatures and all sorts of stuff like that. But it is really intuitive, because if you have a bunch of letters that share similar qualities, like the left side of your C, the left side of your G, the O, the Q, you can set those to all be a single kerning group, and it will kern all of them to the same values for you, so you don't need to keep doing it for every single letter in the alphabet, which takes a lot of time out of it, which is nice.
I would imagine that would be maddening if it didn't do that, so that's good to know.
Yeah, it cuts a lot of time off, and it keeps things consistent, so it's pretty helpful like that.
Yeah. Now, you've said that you're basically self-taught. I mean, how did you get from being somebody who was just designing posters and, you know, focusing on the letter forms and stuff like that, literally just hand drawing them? How did you get from that point to going almost full circle where you're learning how to do all of the technical side of things? Because for those who are probably looking at your artwork right now while they're listening to this podcast, your stuff is very detailed, very precise. It's a huge difference from doing like punk rock, you know, letter forms, you know, with that have a total goth feel, totally hand drawn. Most of the time you can tell it's got that real kind of gritty vibe to it, to you doing these really sophisticated, super clean lines, hyper detailed. I mean, what kind of learning curve did you have in order for you to get to where you are now, technically?
Well, like anything, it just kind of takes time and practice, I think, is really there's no shortcut or silver bullet for it, but, or magic bullet. Silver bullet would be a werewolf, right? But yeah, I think it's just a lot of time and patience, basically, but I'm so obsessive about it that I've bought, you know, hundreds of these old lettering books that I have all around, and a lot of them are kind of like taking an instructional course anyway. Like, a lot of them have these chapters on like how to hold your pen properly, how to hold the brush properly, and here's the strokes you need to do over and over again to learn how to draw it. So like, I am self-taught, but it's also, you know, I'm standing on the shoulders of these sign painting giants from 100 years ago that I'm just reading these old crusty moldy books in my studio and trying to piece it all together. Like, when I first started, I did everything by hand. Like, I just didn't really know how to do it on a computer. I would just scan it in, and I would just threshold it in Photoshop, and I'm like, oh, it's perfectly black and white now. That looks good enough, I guess. And that was my lettering. And over time, like, really begrudgingly, because I hated it at first, I learned Illustrator.
You hated oh, okay, yeah.
Illustrator made me want to throw my computer out the window for like the first couple months I used it, because I was so used to Photoshop, and almost everything felt backwards when I got into it. I was like,
yeah,
what?
and you're doing it by yourself too. Like, I mean, you weren't going to a college to help you sort of.
No, I didn't really have
community
like
aspect.
No, I didn't have like any like mentor like over my shoulder. Like, yeah, just use that button, dummy. Like, why didn't you just do that? So it would take me forever just like YouTube searching tutorials. Like, how do I put this like on the stroke? Like, oh, okay, that's how I do it. And so it's a lot of trial and error and just learning myself through like Google and YouTube. But it's something that takes a lot of patience. I'll just reiterate that. Because if you just like open up a program and think you're going to dive into it and just do like this killer work, like, that's not the case. Like, I've tried to dive into like After Effects or like video programs to, you know, try to, do something new with my work, make a bottle spin around for a mock-up or something. It ain't easy.
Yeah.
Like, you gotta really put in some time to get it to look good. Like, presentation
for somebody like myself, who's definitely, I'd consider myself more of a graphic designer, illustrator, but somebody who loves letter art. I've tried very hard to get even the most basic primary ways to make something look good, and it is very, very time consuming. And the fact that you've done that on your own pretty much is pretty remarkable, man.
Thanks.
I mean, how do you feel about, how did the masters back in the day, 100 years ago, who were creating those amazing certificates and the basically it's like the logos of the companies back in the day. I mean, you see these old like dressers or, furniture pieces, and they got these, paper certificates that are pasted to these or printed on the furniture themselves, just incredibly detailed. I mean, how did they do that back then?
They were just really, really skilled, and it was treated almost as like a given. Nobody even cared. Like I talked to older designers that are like in their 70s, and they knew guys, from like the early 1900s that were like their dad's mentors or whatever. They're like, yeah, they just did like 20 of those a day. Like it was just what they did. Like nobody even considered it art. It was just like, yeah, this is business.
It was never hyper glamorized at all. It wasn't glamorized at all, let alone hyper glamorized, was it?
No, like show card writing was a big job back in the day. Or like ticket writing for like grocery stores. You would just paint like 100 signs a day, like 5-cent apples or something. And today, like you buy those for like $100 in the antique store. Like, wow, this guy must have painted this, and it must have taken like, no, he did that in 5 minutes probably, and he just didn't care, and he moved on. Like it wasn't a big thing. But for like that hyper detailed stuff that you're talking about, I've seen some of these old books that have really wild pen nibs to where they have like these, like 5 points on a pen nib that could do like these shaded ruling lines, and they had a lot of cool tools back then that I just don't see anymore.
They just don't have those. They don't make those anymore.
I don't think so. And if they do, it's probably somewhere like overseas that I'm just not aware of or anything, because not much is really manufactured here. 300-year-old
dude is like creating them in his workshop somewhere, and you got to hike up a bunch of mountains and
pretty
to
much
get to it.
Yeah, I have this book from Germany. I can't remember the title of it, but it was from this company that used to make pantographs. Do you know what that is?
No, what is that?
It's basically like you'll draw something, and it will mimic exactly what you do, like on a stone or wood or metal or something like that. It's almost like a really primitive copying machine. So like your hand is kind of like tethered to this thing. So like you'll draw and it'll move and it'll go the exact same distance as you will.
Oh, wow.
And they had methods where it would actually even enlarge or reduce what you were doing automatically. So like if you did like this small little curve and you wanted it bigger or something, there was like settings you can use on the machine to make that like a bigger curve. So like you could draw it really tiny if that's what your preference was, and it would make it nice and big for you.
Wow.
Yeah, so that machinery is probably just like long gone and forgotten. Like I don't think there's anybody making that stuff these days, but I think it's just because things are so much easier on the computer now that people are like, yeah, I'm not going to spend my time figuring that thing out.
Yeah, it really is just kind of mind blowing when I look at, the design work that was created back in the day by hand, where it literally looks like it was like I feel so spoiled having a computer when I think about how they were doing this by hand.
Me too, man. Me too.
I mean, I'm sort of assuming that this is part of the reason why you have this sort of archivist component to your life, and you've turned it into a little bit of a business too, where you have, is it letteringlibrary.com?
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that site so people can check it out?
Yeah. Lettering Library is this website where I take photos of each and every page of some of these old books that are like way out of copyright. They're in the Creative Commons, and I scan them and I do all these photo edits to them to clean them up and make them nice and pretty, and then I compile this PDF, and then I sell them for like $2 or $3 a pop. So people can use them on their computer or their phone or wherever they're at, just to reference, or print off pages to use as sheets to practice or trace over, things like that. And the reason I did that was because when I was actually at Creative South for the very first time, I was